Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI breaks his silence in an unprecedented document on the sex abuse crisis. Why the former Pope's letter is causing such controversy, and what does it say? Former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, will give us his thoughts, and the papal posse, Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, return with in-depth analysis of Benedict's document and more. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show to get to you tonight. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. An important show, so let's get right to it. On Thursday, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI broke 6 years of near silence by releasing The Church and the Scandal of Sexual Abuse. It's a 6,000-word pronouncement by the former Pope outlining his thoughts on the roots of the abuse crisis, its social context and causes. For analysis of this astounding new document and more is the papal posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Posse, thank you for being here. 2 weeks in a row. This is practically a record. First off, this document has a distinctly pontifical air, even though it's a reflection that Benedict wrote with the permission of Pope Francis and the Secretary of State. I'm going to ask Cardinal Müller the same question in moments, but very quickly, this Pope has been awfully quiet in retirement. Why do you think the Pope Emeritus chose this moment to write a document like this?
We can only speculate about why he did this, but I think there are some pretty clear indications. One of his best friends, Senator Pera, who used to be the president of the Italian Senate, has recently said that the Pope Emeritus, was receiving so many requests from people. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? He must have felt a buildup of pressure, and I would suspect that because we had the summit toward the end of February, he allowed that to take place. He watched what the reaction to it was, and perhaps he says very early on in the document, as someone who was involved at a very high level in these decisions and things that happened, I wondered, what could I do to help at this point? So I think that is where all this kind of comes together.
Father Jerry, is there some larger mission here that perhaps we're missing, or intention in Pope Benedict's mind?
I think his intention is to identify the roots, the context, what led to this crisis in the Church by looking at the theological collapse of moral theology in particular, but also even the more basic question, the Christian's faith in God. Because he says quite clearly in the document that the collapse of faith results in relativism, it results in violence, it results in sexual immorality. I think he wants to get this back to the discussion of what is the Church? Is the Church primarily a human organization trying to set rules of conduct? No. The Church is a worshiping community of faith to serve the Lord. That's going to be the only way that we're authentically faithful.
And maybe he thought this idea was neglected at the summit. I mean, the summit focused an awful lot on clericalism, and we'll get to this in our coming segments. Clericalism, the abuse of authority, but it didn't really get down to a spiritual level, if you will.
Sure. Let me just jump in and say yes, because the question is sexual abuse of minors, apart from being a crime, is it an offense against God that merits eternal damnation if not forgiven? That really was never in the discussion that we saw coming out of that meeting. I think the Pope wants to get us back to that.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting the way he weaves together, as Ratzinger has always done. He's just got this brilliant mind, and he's able to weave together very complex ideas and boil them down into a way that's quite simple, that gives you a narrative and where things are going. And for me, I think one of the striking things that he talks about very early on is people talk about the Church being this or that, but it's actually a way of life. He even says, back in the early church, Christianity was spoken about in Greek as the hodos, a way of living. So these things all have to be part of one another. It's just that it's not just that there are ideas and that there are truths, but those truths have to be lived out, and that is what the church itself is. And he says, when we don't have that combination of truth and other things in the way that we live it out, the church itself, which is God's community, it's our communion together for how we're supposed to live, how God wants us to be, that is in jeopardy.
Belief or the lack thereof have consequences. And we're seeing them. And we're seeing them. We will deep dive into this document. We will highlight the sections you need to see. But it reflects Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger's ideas on this issue for a long time. He told me this back in 2003 when I interviewed him at the height of the first wave of the sex abuse crisis. Now, I asked him if he would identify the root causes of the crisis in the United States. Watch.
I would distinguish perhaps between two different elements, a general element and a specific element of this time and of this scandal of today. General element is, as I see it, the weakness of human beings, even of priests. Even in the communion of priests and bishops, we have to wait that these things can happen. Second point is more specific, why in this time it was so often and was more than in past times. And I think the essential point is a weakness of faith, because only if I'm really in confidence personal with the Lord, if the Lord is for me not an idea, but as a person of my deepest friendship, if I'm really convinced and really in contact of love with the Lord will help me in these temptations, and I can even wins what seems impossible. So I would say the essential point is for me weakness of the faith and not a sufficient presence of the faith in the church. I think it was a problem of the last 40, 50 years. So I think first point is relearn, reconvert to a deepened faith. And education in the faith, I think also that in the last perhaps 40, 50 years was not so clear the validity of the moral teaching of the church. We had so many masters in the church who teach it in another way and said, no, this is not a sin, this is not a sin, this is common, and what is average of doing is also permitted. And with these ideas that we do not have a clear moral teaching.
There you have it, moral teaching and the masters in the church. Your thoughts looking at that 20 years later?
Well, the moral theology that undergirds the way of Christian life is about moral absolutes, the difference between good and evil, the possibility of doing good with God's grace, the reprehensible nature of evil, and that there are intrinsically disordered or immoral actions. That is where moral theology needs to be. It hasn't been for many decades, unfortunately.
He alluded to those masters, Bob, with a little wry smile, and he describes them in this new document, which we'll get to in a moment. Your thoughts as you watch that?
Well, what he means by that is the church, he says, I think at one point, he says the church is supposed to master us, that, that God, we ought to be submissive to God because he is the true master of us all. But there are others who wanted to create a church in their own image and likeness, and so there's a very tart observation in here too, where he talks about, well, what should we do now? Should we create another church? Oh, yeah. As the Protestants did, and he says, we know what happened with that. And we can see what's happened also with these theologians who thought they could redefine the church.
And went off the rails. Yeah. We are going to get back to our conversation in a moment, but I'm now delighted to be joined with some analysis of this historic document by Cardinal Gerhard Müller. He is the former head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, one of Benedict's closest collaborators. He joins us now from Rome. Your Eminence, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much to you.
I want to start with why you believe Pope Benedict would issue this letter at this moment. Why now? He's the Pope Emeritus.
He is a Pope Emeritus, but he has a responsibility for the Church. He worked whole his life for the Church in very high and important positions. At the end, as the Holy Father for the complete Church. And he is very concerned about the misconduct of a certain number of priests. Is a minority, not the majority, but it is enough. And the credibility of the church suffered so much. And therefore, here we gave a deep analysis for the reasons of the development, for the coming to this point at which we are now.
Cardinal Müller, the Pope Benedict, the Pope Emeritus, he lays out a historical context for the breakdown of Catholic morality and the breakdown of formation at seminaries. He writes the following. In various seminaries, homosexual clubs were established which acted more or less openly and significantly changed the climate in the seminaries. The Holy See knew of such problems without being informed precisely. As a first step, an apostolic visitation was arranged of seminaries in the United States. The visitation that took place brought no new insights, apparently because various powers had joined forces to conceal the true situation. A second visitation was ordered and brought considerably more insights. On the whole, failed to achieve any outcomes. Is this what Pope Francis refers to as the gay lobby, or others have called a gay network? And what impact has that had on this exodus crisis we're seeing?
Yeah, I think these visitations were not clear enough, and they made too much compromises, and they didn't want to be too conservative and all these categories they had. But the consequences we have now. You must avoid the mistakes in the beginning, that you don't have a big problem at the end. And this for Catholic thinking or for moral thinking is absolutely unacceptable that in a seminary of coming priests there are so deep moral misconduct in the organization of homosexual clubs and all the things that are signs of a deep decline of the church, of the spirituality, of the understanding of their mission they have. The priest is not a private person. A priest is given to God. He has this identification with Jesus Christ, who gave his life for the people, and we cannot remain self-centered and in an egoistic way, looking only for our interests and for having fun. This has nothing to do with the discipleship of Jesus Christ.
And not only does he call out the seminary implosion in the training of priests, but then he calls out what he calls conciliar bishops who, quote, were understood to have a critical or negative attitude toward the hitherto existing traditions. He calls them almost proponents of the world. How detrimental was this type of bishop, who was promulgated really from Vatican II onward?
These wrong shepherds call themselves conciliar bishops, but it had nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council, which wanted a renewal of the church, beginning from the Holy Scripture with the Word of God, with the teaching of the fathers. They excused themselves for doing nothing. They said, the practical, the practice, and the pastoral is more important than the doctrine and the moral behavior. We must be close to the people. Jesus sent the apostles and the successors of the apostles, the bishops and the priests, to everybody to teach his doctrine he gave, to follow his example. And this is a way of the overcoming of this crisis, and not this strange and sometimes so stupid behavior of some people within the church.
Cardinal Müller, there was a section reading Pope Benedict's letter where you came to mind, and he talked about how John Paul II and then Cardinal Ratzinger made the decision, and I'll read it to you here, that many of these congregations that were at the time entrusted with trials and reviewing the crimes of clerics, they were not prosecuting them. They were simply not handing down prosecutions. So that was moved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. I'd like your reaction to this. He writes, I agreed with Pope John Paul II that it was appropriate to assign the competence for these offenses to the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. This arrangement also made it possible to impose the maximum penalty, i.e. expulsion from the clergy, which could not have been imposed under other legal provisions. It wasn't a trick to be able to impose the maximum penalty, but is a consequence of the importance of the faith for the church. And he goes on, he talks about the assault on faith and how that needs to be protected against as well. Give me a sense of how that vision of the CDF, which you inherited, compares to what we have today.
I hope that it didn't change the dealing with these problems. We have the politics of zero tolerance, and we must punish those who are responsible for these crimes. And in this grave crimes they are doing, some priests, they cannot continue in this service for the people of God. Surely we must have the proportion between the guilt and the penalty. But if there is a grave guilt, it's my meaning, such a man cannot go to the altar to preach the word of God and to represent the person of Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd who gave his life for the sheep.
There was some tension, I know, when you were at the CDF, because cases were coming to you, they were being reviewed, and as penalties were handed down, there were some who were very upset with the penalties handed down. They thought you should have had more mercy, or more mercy should have been extended. Some of these cases were simply dispensed with. Others, the penalties were dissolved. Your thought on how that might not have been a good idea, given what we're seeing now?
Yeah, we must first have to have mercy for the victims, and for the credibility of the church, for the faith. That is the first responsibility, the superiors in the church, the responsibility of the bishop. This is a wrong meaning only to have the discussions and the arguments with more pity to have for them, for mercy to have for them. That is not the question. The question is that some sorts of behavior of producing evil cannot be allowed in the Holy Church. We all are sinners, but here has to do not only with sins, but also with crimes against God and against man.
Final question. Give me your sense of how Pope Benedict treated and dealt with these sex abuse cases, and I'm talking about priests and bishops, and what do you think his legacy will be in this area?
Pope John Paul II and the Cardinal Ratzinger, and then later Pope Benedict, I think they managed very good the crisis. They made decisive decisions for handling these problems with these decisions and the institution that they brought it back to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and also the understanding of this problem. It's not only the handling in a juridical way, but also the mental understanding of the deepness of these problems. I think we must here be more rigid and more clear, and I think John Paul II and Benedict XVI began this way, and we must continue in their line.
Your Eminence, thank you so much for your time and for being with us. We'll talk to you again soon. Posse, your reactions to what you heard from Cardinal Müller. Father Jerry, particularly your thoughts on the canon law aspect that he alluded to that's in the document, where he talked about the tribunal that was set up at the CDF because the Congregation for Clergy weren't properly handing out the penalties necessary in these cases.
Yeah, this is a difficult part of Pope Emeritus's discussion, where he says that the Congregation for Clergy, which is the congregation that handled complaints of evil behavior by priests, was not giving enough convictions because of procedural obstacles. So rather than reform those procedural obstacles or reform the management of that congregation, they shifted the responsibility to the doctrine of the faith. Then the doctrine of the faith, they were kind of overwhelmed by the number of cases. Right. They had to call in priests from all over the world to come in and handle the cases. But even then, it wasn't done as tribunals. It was done as administrative processes, which is kind of an abbreviated form, doesn't have the formalities. Part of it, again, is that with such an overwhelming number, to conduct trials and to observe all of the rules would have extended them out too long. Yeah. This gets back to something I've said on this show many times. We need a tribunal to handle sex abuse cases, special tribunals that would have speed, or accelerated schedules and ability to handle these things.
And that sounds like something Benedict supported. I mean, he talks about John Paul and he's supporting these tribunals set up at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. He also raises alarm about the rights of the accused being elevated above the wounds of the victim. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things where the part of the church that says we need greater holiness, which is always the case, and others who say we need to reform structures, of which I also believe, I think that they come together here. And it's clear that there have to be more resources and more personnel devoted to it when you have this sort of just tidal wave. We can see from the statistics that in the 70s and 80s, there's this enormous bump up in the number of cases that are being sent to Rome because the local dioceses cannot handle them, and so Rome is going to have to deal with it. But we didn't see, and maybe there's a legitimate criticism that John Paul II and Benedict should themselves have beefed up the offices that could have dealt with this.
Bob, they laicized 800 people. I mean, Benedict had 3,000 cases.
But there's still, I mean, the usual criticism of Rome is that it moves very slowly and everything. But in these cases in particular, where you need some justice and you need procedures, careful procedures to be carried out, I don't think there was enough oomph put into this. That said, he's very clear that they wanted to do a certain thing. I'm not sure that it actually happened, but at least we know, we can see where the lack was. And between what Müller says and what Benedict says, we're starting to get a shape of how to fix this problem.
Well, he takes a jab there at those who pled mercy in all these cases.
Sure.
And rather than demanding justice for these victims.
And actually, the American bishops get a lot of credit because they were the ones that went over to Rome and said it is not sufficient that somebody be given a penalty of a year outside of the priest, and then he comes back. They said no. Yeah. And what Ratzinger, Cardinal Müller said, absolutely correct. These people aren't qualified.
I also would say that I think there's an enriching of the idea of mercy here, because there's been some criticism that some priests, bishops, archbishops, etc., are being the object of mercy when it comes to imposing penalties on them, but forgetting that there are victims. And then one of the things that Benedict goes on to say is we must also recognize that there's a threat to the faith.
Right. The faith is under assault.
The faith must be protected as well, and people don't recognize that this is a good, this is a public good that must be protected, because the faith helps us all. It helps us in our weakness. It helps us helps to form us and push us in a certain direction.
He raises a particular conversation he had with a victim who the perpetrator was so heinous in invoking the words of consecration during the abuse, and he said, how can you disassociate the faith from the abuse? It's very difficult. So there's a wound to the faith as well as the individual. That's a key point. I want to move on here. This ongoing sex abuse crisis, Benedict suggests, was a product of the moral laxity that swept the West in the 1960s. The young rebels of 1968, Benedict writes, fought an all-out sexual freedom, one which no longer conceded any norms. He goes on to say, part of the physiognomy of the Revolution of '68 was that pedophilia was now also diagnosed as allowed and appropriate. The extensive collapse of the next generation of priests in those years and the very high number of laicizations were a consequence of all these processes. The Pope has been getting some pushback for this analysis. There's almost a vicious reaction from some progressives in the Church who say, what about the abuse that happened before the sexual revolution, before 1960?
Well, of course, human nature being what it is, there is going to be abuse ahead of time too. But as I just said, we have the statistics. We have charts that show us exactly how things began.
Well, we'll put it up on the. This is the John Jay report that some are citing and saying, "Oh, well, the John Jay report is the Bible on this." Well, here it is. Here's the chart, and you can clearly see it spikes in the 70s and 80s, and it begins in the 1960s, goes up through the 80s, and then there's a sharp decline.
And look, it only makes sense if the public perception of sexual morality becomes lax, and in some ways, as Benedict says, it almost disappears. It's only a matter of consent between two people. Is that not going to affect people inside the Church as well as others outside? Of course it doesn't. And so it's only logical that you begin to see this. And then as there's a drawing back, as there is in secular society a bit, from the consequences of the sexual revolution, we start to see also in the Church that there's a decline.
People are scandalized, I think, Father, that you have the Church reflecting the world's values. But that's the Pope's whole point here, Benedict's whole point. He's saying you had theologians in the Church who were willing to accommodate the world by distorting the teaching.
Yes, you had this phenomenon called situation ethics, which was very popular and was used as a moral analysis, saying the analysis of an act depends on the circumstances. And Pope Emeritus Benedict goes after it. No, if morality is not an absolute determination of good and evil, as determined by God the Creator in His law, then morality is simply the decision of the powerful and the influential and how they want us to behave. We have to really remember that the influence of the world on the Church is a problem right from the start. The spirit of the world, which reflects the diabolical undermining of God's creation, is always there. Mm-hmm. And in matters of sex, it's always a problem if it's not resisted.
It seems to me we're dealing here with a tale of two sex abuse narratives. Let's face it. The summit in February determined that clericalism was at the root of what we're seeing here. Benedict identifies something else along with the sexual revolution. He writes, at the same time, independently of this development, the sexual revolution, Catholic moral theology suffered a collapse that rendered the Church defenseless against these changes in society. Until the Second Vatican Council, Catholic moral theology was largely founded on natural law, while sacred scripture was only cited for background or substantiation. In the Council's struggle for a new understanding of Revelation, the natural law option was largely abandoned, and a moral theology based entirely on the Bible was demanded. In the end, it was chiefly the hypothesis that morality was to be exclusively determined by the purposes of human action that prevailed. Consequently, there could be no longer anything that constituted an absolute good any more than anything fundamentally evil. There could be only relative value judgments. There no longer was an absolute good, but only the relative better, contingent on the moment and on circumstances. In essence, he's saying that there was an accommodation, really, for the moment, a license almost granted to the age.
Yeah, and he even describes this in absolute terms. What he says is that, as we see in the case of Jesus himself and then the martyrs, who are the witnesses to the faith, that the willingness to die for the essential truths of the faith is the crux of what the Church is. And so if truth drops out of that equation, and the Church is just sort of there as a facilitator for what makes people feel good at a given moment, then we've lost the root of what our faith is about, that God communicated to us a certain understanding of who He is and who we are and how He expects us to live. And at that point, Christianity has nothing left to offer the world, and the Church itself is in jeopardy.
It is also, this speaks to that, the battle we continue to see between those who want a more laxed moral teaching and Benedict, who is here again insisting there are things that are objectively and gravely evil.
Absolutely. Well, haven't we heard this in the past few years? We have to concentrate on the positive aspect of homosexual relationships and not just condemn it. And the answer is no. A relationship based on sodomy is intrinsically evil. You don't sodomize someone and do a good act. That's an immoral act. Anything that leads to it has to be forbidden and resisted. Why? Because you love those persons and you don't want them to offend God or do damage to their own souls. So when a bishop says, as they did in Germany, we need to bless homosexual civil unions because there's some good in that. Wrong answer. There is no good in blessing a relationship based on intrinsically immoral actions. That's always been the teaching of the church. It's only after the 60s, suddenly some theologians come along and say, well, the intention of the people is to express love to each other, so it's really not that bad. It is bad. It's wrong.
What do you make of his contention, and we got into this with Cardinal Müller earlier, about the conciliar bishops that Vatican II sort of envisioned as ideal, and the ruinous effects of that mentality upon the church, because inevitably these are the men who are protecting and dispensing the church's teaching.
I found it interesting that he mostly, there are large swaths of this that are autobiographical. And when he talks about Germany in particular, he names names and he has anecdotes of things that happen. In fact, it's hilarious. At one point he says that in certain seminaries, the reading of his books, of Cardinal Ratzinger's books, kind of indicated to the powers that be that you were unsuitable for the priesthood.
Don't want to ordain that guy.
And you know, what does this all mean? I think Cardinal Müller, though, is quite right that the type of bishop that sometimes is now talked about as a conciliar bishop, which is to say laxer and indulgent even with the behavior of his priests, that is not at all what Vatican Council II envisioned. What it actually envisioned was a pastoral bishop, yes, but a pastoral bishop who was backed up and faithful to what the faith was actually going to be renewed by, and help people in their own lives to appropriate it in a deeply personal way. That was a very different vision than what the so-called conciliar bishops turned out to be.
I have to move on to this. Benedict talks about the little ones in the document. He quotes Jesus. And he has this to say about those who would harm the faith. The word the little ones, he writes, in the language of Jesus means the common believers who can be confounded in their faith by the intellectual arrogance of those who think they're so clever. So here Jesus protects the deposit of faith with an emphatic threat of punishment to those who do it harm. The modern use of the sentence is not in itself wrong, but it must not obscure the original meaning. In it, it becomes clear against any guarantourism. That is, not only the right of the accused that is important and requires a guarantee. Great goods, such as the faith, are equally important. A balanced canon law that responds to the whole of Jesus' message must, therefore, not only provide a guarantee for the accused, the respect for whom is the legal good, it must also protect the faith, which is also an important legal asset. Now, this is a clarification of what the little means, and it really is a stark warning. Your reaction to that as a canon lawyer?
This reminds me of, in a marriage case, you have the petitioner, the respondent, then you have the defender of the bond. And the defender of the bond is meant to defend the Catholic teaching that marriage is indissoluble. Likewise, the Pope is saying, in a case where you have a priest accused of grave sexual immorality and a victim, we also have the faith of the church, which is assaulted by one of its ministers using his position as a priest in order to subvert his role as father and turn it into an evil predator. I think that he's onto something very important here. What I'd also, this reminds me of Mother Angelica, if I could say it quite honestly. Why is this network so successful? Because she says, the faith isn't that hard. Turn to Jesus, pray to the Holy Spirit, do the 10 Commandments as best you can, go to confession, say your prayers. Guess what? I'll see you in heaven, God willing. That's what religion's about. Religion is not about theologians inventing systems largely based on relativism, Enlightenment thinking, nothing to do with the gospel.
You know, when I read this, I did think of her.
Did you? Well,
particularly
here we
that
are.
barn burner down in Denver when she,
Yes.
said, you're corrupting the common people and their faith. You're trying to shake the faith from them.
When they had a
with your
woman
clever
take the role
slogan.
of Jesus in the Station of the Cross, which was an absolute Gnostic overturning of Catholicism. Jesus was a real man. If we don't believe that, get off the scene. You're not part of this group.
Isn't Pope Benedict also suggesting here that this deformed teaching, not only did it encourage this deviant and evil behavior in the church, it really emboldened the predators in some ways. They were protected. They had moral license. Teaching was protecting them.
Yeah, I think you can probably expect that a figure like former Cardinal McCarrick felt that he had been almost vindicated in a period like the 1970s and the 1980s, that the church seemed to be moving in this somewhat indulgent direction. I'd like to draw a distinction here, though, that I think some people might be confused about. When the Pope Emeritus is defending the faith and the importance of the church as a public good, he is not engaging in clericalism. Clericalism makes no appearance in this document. And in fact, I think what he's advocating there is the exact opposite, that this isn't just protecting people who happen to occupy positions of authority and power and a certain status. He's talking about the actual reality of what the faith is and what the church is, rather than just individual figures. So we want to make sure that when we talk about the faith is a good that has to be preserved and has to be protected as victims need to be protected, we don't allow this to be confused with some sort of return to clericalism where I can claim anything because, of course, the reputation of the church will be harmed.
Right.
No, the truth is what defends the church.
And the truth of the matter is, on a practical level, no one was tougher on these abusers than Benedict.
Right.
At the CDF and as Pope. This is the guy who imprisoned Maciel, sent Maciel away, had the trial. This is the guy who sent 800 priests out of the priesthood because of their acts. He was very hard. In fact, it was others who were. John Paul was much more. Let's be careful, observe the process.
No.
It was Benedict who was the clear-eyed German on
the
this.
Maciel case, which people are familiar with, the Final Legionaries of Christ, he was being protected by different people over the years in the Holy See. It was only Cardinal Ratzinger who said, no, we're good, this is going to go to trial. And then when he became Pope, he confirmed the sentence against him. Yeah, we have to credit Pope Benedict with having done a lot, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think people forget. They just forget. After a few years, it fades from memory, and then the pieces are hard to put back together. Benedict addresses why he thinks pedophilia reached the proportions that they did. Ultimately, he says the reason is the absence of God. He writes that one of the problems is our attitude toward the Eucharist. He writes, let us consider this with regard to a central issue, the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. What predominates is not a new reverence for the presence of Christ's death and resurrection, but a way of dealing with him that destroys the greatness of the mystery. The declining participation of the Sunday Eucharistic celebration shows how little we Christians of today still know about appreciating the greatness of the gift that consists in his real presence. Boy, talk about Mother Angelica, nostalgia coming back. How does the way in which he's envisioning Christ and people seek Christ in their lives in the Eucharist affect this question, and is this part of the remedy?
This is the absolute key to it, if I can say that, because what is Christ's gift to the church? Himself in sacramental form. And if we don't treat that the way we would treat Christ if he was physically present here as he was to the apostles after the resurrection, if we treat that casually, without due reverence, with ritual, with forms, with an adoring spirit, the category of reverence, I mean, just say that. He is saying that reverence is the key to not only honoring God, but his creation. When reverence goes out the door, what do we have? We have all the evils of relativism, immorality, and what does that mean? Victims, meaning young people and others, get victimized by powerful people who've all dismissed that morality and said, you know what, I'm in charge here. For me, this is okay.
Yeah.
And then, when they get caught, the hierarchy says, okay, here's your money, you keep quiet, and then Father X, you're going to another parish. That's what happened. He's condemning that.
Yeah. Bob, very quickly, and then I want to ask you about this document.
I mean, he says specifically in this document that look at the way we treat the Eucharist on special occasions, weddings, funerals, and whatnot, in which it's just assumed that all family members or friends who show up, whether they're Catholic, whether they're even Catholic or whether they're Catholics in good standing or they're Protestants or whatever, are entitled somehow to receive the Eucharist. And of course, there have been some celebrated cases where a person has been denied the Eucharist at a mother's funeral or something that it makes it appear as if the church is being unmerciful, but it's a sentimentality. It's sort of like saying we all have a right.
Booby prize.
Yeah, we all have a right to get a piece of that bread. So why are you telling me and insulting me at this particular moment because I've got some problem in my past? you know, it's often said that sentimentality is sort of the death of truth. And so it's not surprising that there's a sentimentality about the Eucharist that then spreads out, that the very reference in the fear of God and the fear of how we act toward him and toward one another begins to disappear as well.
Yeah. What does the document achieve? Or does it achieve anything that the summit in February did not? And if we accept Benedict's diagnosis of the problem, which is a breakdown of morality, a breakdown of teaching, a breakdown in reverence to the Eucharist, the centerpiece of the faith, what is the appropriate remedy here?
Well, I don't know about the remedies other than returning to God. I mean, that seems to be the central message that he wants to send to us, and that this is urgent not only for the Church, but for the world, because he says that this breakdown reflects where we are in our Western society, that we have no basis. It used to be that at least those of us in the United States had this sense that even the public order, our original documents, the public order, the Declaration of Independence, says men have been endowed by their Creator. And he rightly says something that any American certainly who's loyal to the Constitution could agree with, and that is, if you don't find the dignity of the human person and the freedom allowed to a human person in the truth that we are all creatures made in the image and likeness of God, where does it come from? Right. It's virtually impossible to establish where human rights, where human dignity comes from without a God. So I think what he's telling us is we are facing the ultimate breakdown, not only in the Church, but also in our public lives. And there's only one answer here. That's to return to the reality, with the ultimate reality, which is God himself.
Are these battling diagnoses of this sex abuse crisis, Father?
Well, there are some who would like to say this is simply a question of power relations, which basically fills in with a Marxist and socialist type of view of life, that everything's up for grabs, the most powerful grab things, and then they impose their will on others. What really lies behind this is a rejection of God's law regarding the proper use of human sexuality, and also the mission of ordained priests, that they are meant to lead people to heaven. They are not primarily there to serve as, running a parish and keeping a business going or doing whatever, teaching classes. All of that is in service of the mission of salvation. Now, when we get down to the specific question, how do we reform the Church in this matter?
Right.
I think his answer is correct. The renewal of theology, particularly moral theology, based on metaphysical thinking, which identifies that reality is a category not subject to our manipulation. We can manipulate how we react to reality, and that's where you get into the make-believe world. What's the difference between genuflecting in church and walking into Disney World? Disney World is all made up. Jesus is really in the tabernacle. So people have awe when they see the great castle at Disney World. Mouse. Hey, guess what? I thought that was fun when I was a kid, but then I learned something more important. God is physically in the tabernacle in my church. My duty in life is to live in a way that I'm worthy to receive him, so I'll see him when I go to my grave. That's a beautiful message. Instead, what are we getting from the moralist? Well, you know what? However you feel at the time, as long as you don't hurt anybody, and you're the one who determines whether they're getting hurt, do what you want. And that's wrong.
Go see Mickey.
Yeah.
The Washington Post today said that this reflects the release of this letter, and by a retired pope, reflects an ideological division in the Church, that this is somehow Team Benedict rising. Do you accept that notion?
Well, it's not surprising that the Washington Post reads everything through the categories of
right and left, and team this and team that.
Politics and whatnot. I wouldn't quite put it that way. I think everybody is on the same team, really. At least we ought to all be on God's side, not on our side or your side or someone else's side. But it is striking that Benedict, who is the most gentlemanly of men, and contrary to the slanders that often were said about him, he's the most gentle soul in a way. He's really an academic, and he's just trying to lay out things. I think that we can say, though, that there is some expression of something that he couldn't resist, that he had to speak out at this moment. Perhaps he's closer to death than we realize. Let's hope not, but this is very lucid, it's very pointed, it's not even all that long. You can read it in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes. And I think he just felt an obligation that at this particular moment, this had to be said. This is not against anybody, this is in favor of the truths and the way of life that the Church has preached throughout its entire existence, and that we need desperately again.
No, I think it's striking that He didn't, it doesn't appear, and our reportage suggests, he did not have this statement vetted. He informed the Holy Father and the Secretary of State that he was writing this document, but it was not vetted, and the implied knowledge of that is he distributed it himself through secondary sources. They didn't go through the Vatican Press Service to release this. So there are indications there. I simply think he feels this is a portion of this conversation that has not been had yet, or that was somehow being overlooked, and he wanted to make it front and center, to draw people's attention to it.
No, and I'm a canon lawyer, and I fully believe in law as being necessary to combat this, the enforcement of law. But much more important than any law is the state of faith in the life of the church. And that's where the real distress, I think he sees in Germany, and will be very blunt about it, Germany is becoming a Protestantized version of Catholicism, and not even a serious version of Protestantism, because it's embracing moral relativism, which serious Protestants reject. And, the time for this rebuke, we could say, from the Pope to the current state of the church from the former Pope is very propitious. Because right now in the United States, and I know this from talking to many people who watch this program, Raymond, people are stunned that the hierarchy and the Vatican does not act decisively to root this problem out. They have endless meetings, endless discussions, references to things they don't. What does clericalism mean? People have no idea. What they understand is, if you were with Jesus, you don't commit evil acts on minors. If you do that, guess what? Jesus' representatives on earth are going to punish you. That's basically what needs to be done.
And then the secular authorities are going to punish you.
And they're relentless, thank God.
Yeah. Last week, I want to move on to another topic before we run out of time. Archbishop Wilton Gregory was appointed the new Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Washington. He did an interview just days ago. He had this to say about his friend, Cardinal McCarrick, who perhaps should have gone to jail in a just world. That was the question posed to him. Watch.
In a more just world, if these events had been known, yes, he should have gone to jail, as should have any cleric who had harmed a child.
Now, McCarrick was guilty of abuse toward adults, too, predominantly young people. The focus of the commentary surrounding McCarrick has largely been focused on the minors, but he abused adults as well. And again, I think that has slipped through the cracks of this entire discussion all along.
Well, we live in the Me Too age now, so it's not surprising that Archbishop Gregory would suggest that there should have been a strong response to this. But we're back. I think the proof in the pudding for him is going to be, is he willing to take steps so that some of us can know why it was that not only were these things covered up when they were being committed decades ago by then Archbishop and then Cardinal McCarrick, and then why weren't there penalties imposed by the church at the time? So the ball, I think, is now in Archbishop Wilton Gregory's court.
And he said at his coming out party that he was going to be transparent, he would tell the truth, and he would also tell people if he didn't know the truth, he'd be willing to be honest. So we'll see what happens in the days ahead. He also commented, Archbishop Gregory did, on immigration and the president's current policy. Watch this.
Citizenship for immigrants who are in this country now.
Yes, I have, and I believe that. I believe that the rhetoric, the hostile, brutal rhetoric that is often labeled and given to immigrant people is completely contrary, certainly to the gospel, but I also think contrary to the highest principles of this nation, a nation comprised almost exclusively from immigrant stock.
So the country is not full, in your estimate?
It certainly is not full.
Your thoughts?
Well, it's a political question. How many immigrants should be taken in? It's a legal question. What are the mechanisms for getting here legally? And then it's a law enforcement question. How do you deter and prohibit illegal immigration? To focus on overheated rhetoric is not to look at the whole question. It's certainly Catholic moral teaching that the state has a right to regulate the ingress, the coming in of foreigners into a country. So this is an area where there is no Catholic position, so to speak. How many immigrants should you take in? what you do with illegal immigrants. We have to act with compassion, but also justice, because people who violate the law should not be rewarded for doing that.
Yeah, no, I've heard a number of Catholic officials, people in the Catholic circles say, wait a minute, we have to welcome everybody. The gospel tells us to welcome the stranger, and why are we separating these families? Well, I've been on the border. I've spoken to border enforcement. They will tell you they have to separate the adult from the child to determine if they're together in the interest of the child. We have an obligation. We didn't ask for it, but we have an obligation to protect this child coming into our midst. That requires separating so they're not subject to abuse or domination. Why is that such a hard concept? But it sounds here, and this was in reference to the asylum question, about is there a set number? And Trump said the other day, these people need to know, our country's full. You can't come, don't come, because there's a crisis at the border.
Well, we've talked about this before, and I'll repeat myself, but I think it's true, and this comes down from Pope Francis as well, that the principle of being welcoming and charitable toward people who are in difficult circumstances is clear. That's a Christian principle. As Father rightly says, though, policy is something different, and we can't simply slide immediately from a Christian principle to political policies, because those have to be determined in particular circumstances. It would actually be wrong in certain circumstances not to admit people, but in other circumstances, it's clear that there are multiple considerations. So it's a more complicated thing, I think, than the kind of moralistic way of talking about it that we hear.
There is a powerful bit of video I want to share with you. The Pope and Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, are holding an ecumenical retreat at the Vatican for the leaders of southern Sudan. Now, the country gained independence from Sudan proper in 2011. Following decades of war, and then they quickly collapsed into civil war. Now, this video is really powerful. The Pope today begged the leaders of South Sudan at the Vatican for peace, and he accompanied that plea with this dramatic and pained gesture. Watch. Unbelievable. I mean, the poor Pope, you can hear his labored breathing through that entire moment. Your thoughts?
He's the Pope, and I hope they vetted what he was doing here. But I hear from a lot of people who are experts about Islam that gestures like this are gestures of submission rather than gestures of humility and imploring people to do the right thing. I just hope
that it's interpreted in the way it was intended.
Interpreted the right way. I personally find it a little uncomfortable to watch that video, frankly. But when we talk about multiculturalism, we want to understand what a gesture like that might convey
how it's being
to a large part of the world, actually.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of the Pope, he's expressing that, like Christ, he has come to serve, not to be served, and that he wants these people to realize that the head of Christendom, of Christianity, wants them to stop fighting. You know, there's a large Catholic population, relatively speaking,
and we've been covering
in
this
South
for
Sudan
years.
for years, and all the bishops
been butchered and
the Pope is protecting their interests by trying to get this war to end. So he risks being misinterpreted. He's certainly not submitting to Islam in any way. He's giving a gesture of basically loving concern for people who are, have the future of a lot of people in their hands.
Yep. Thank you both. Papal Posse, thanks for coming down. And we will reconvene soon, I'm sure. You can always find commentary by Father Gerald Murray, Robert Royal at thecatholicthing.org. And we will post the entirety of Pope Benedict's message on sexual abuse on Facebook. I know it's already on Catholic Thing and at CNA and all the other EWTN resources. Easter's just around the corner, and Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power, makes a wonderful gift. It's available at bookstores everywhere, online, and at the EWTN Religious Catalog. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.